A hunter fed a pregnant bear dying throughout the winter. A year later, he heard a sound and cried in the heart of the Rocky Mountains, where wilderness ruled supreme and civilization felt like a distant memory. Hank Bennett's life had become a symphony of solitude. The weathered wooden cabin he'd built with his own hands stood as a testament to his self-imposed exile, its sturdy beams groaning softly in the winter winds that swept across the snow-laden landscape. Each morning, as the sun painted the mountain peaks in hues of amber and gold, Hank would emerge from his refuge, his breath visible in the crisp mountain air, ready to face another day in his carefully constructed isolation. At 55, Hank's face bore the marks of a life spent in the elements, deep lines etched by sun and wind, and eyes that held both wisdom and an underlying sadness that few ever got close enough to notice. His graying beard and calloused hands spoke of years spent learning the mountain's secrets, tracking its wildlife, and guiding occasional tourists through its safer passages. But it was the harder trails, the ones that led deep into the untamed wilderness, that Hank kept for himself. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us which city you are watching from. Let's continue. This particular morning started like any other, with Hank checking his gear and preparing for a day of tracking deer through the fresh snow. The winter had been unusually harsh, driving many of the mountain's inhabitants closer to the lower elevations in search of food. As he followed a set of promising tracks, the silence of the forest was absolute, broken only by the soft crunch of his boots in the snow and the occasional whisper of wind through the pine branches. The tracking led him to a clearing he knew well, one he'd crossed hundreds of times before, but today was different. As he approached, his trained eye caught movement, something large and brown against the pristine white of the snow. Keeping to the tree line, Hank moved closer, his heart rate quickening as he recognized the form of a young female grizzly bear. She lay in the snow, her powerful frame betraying signs of exhaustion and hunger that were obvious to his experienced gaze. What struck Hank most weren't the bear's physical conditions, though they were concerning enough. It was her eyes, deep pools of amber that held an intelligence and desperation that resonated with something deep within him. In those eyes, he saw a reflection of his own solitude, his own struggle against the elements and life itself. The bear watched him warily, but didn't move to flee or attack, a behavior that both intrigued and worried him. Drawing on decades of experience in the wilderness, Hank knew he should back away slowly and leave the bear to fend for herself. Nature had its own way of handling these situations, and interference rarely led to positive outcomes. Yet something held him in place, rooted to the spot as surely as the ancient pines that surrounded them. Perhaps it was the way she looked at him. Or maybe it was something else, a calling he couldn't quite understand but felt compelled to answer. With movements so slow they were barely perceptible, Hank reached into his jacket pocket, where he kept his emergency rations. His fingers closed around a piece of dried venison he'd prepared himself. Every instinct, honed by years in the wilderness, screamed at him to walk away, but his heart, that part of him he'd tried so hard to silence over the years, urged him forward. "Easy there, girl," he whispered, his voice rough from disuse. The bear's ears twitched at the sound, but she remained still, watching him with those intense eyes. Hank took a careful step forward, then another, holding the meat out in front of him like an offering. The bear's nostrils flared, catching the scent, and her head lifted slightly from the snow. As he watched her devour the offered food, Hank felt something shift inside him. Like the first crack in a frozen lake at the onset of spring, he found himself thinking of her as Rose, the name coming to him unbidden, perhaps because of the faint reddish tint in her brown fur when the sunlight hit it just right. It had been years since he'd given a name to anything, years since he'd allowed himself to care about another living being. The encounter lasted only minutes, but as Hank made his way back to his cabin that evening, he knew something fundamental had changed. The walls of solitude he'd built around himself seemed somehow less solid, less necessary. That night, as he sat by his fireplace, the flames casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls, he found himself thinking about Rose, wondering if she'd found shelter from the bitter cold. The next morning, against his better judgment, Hank packed extra supplies in his backpack. He told himself he was just going to check on her. Nothing more. But as he stepped out into the crisp morning air, he couldn't deny the surge of anticipation he felt. It was an emotion he hadn't experienced in years, and it both thrilled and terrified him. Little did Hank know that this simple act of kindness, this moment of connection with a wild creature, would set in motion a chain of events that would not only challenge everything he thought he knew about survival in the wilderness, but would also force him to confront the very reasons he'd chosen this life of solitude in the first place. As he made his way back to the clearing, following his tracks from the previous day, the mountain seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would unfold between the lonely man and the desperate bear who had somehow found each other in the vast wilderness. The days that followed marked a subtle but profound change in Hank's carefully ordered world. Each morning, he found himself drawn back to the clearing, his steps quickening as he approached, his heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and concern. Rose remained in the area, and as Hank observed her from a safe distance, he noticed something that made his breath catch in his throat. She was pregnant, her movements slow and deliberate, her body showing the unmistakable signs of impending motherhood. The discovery awakened something in Hank that he thought he'd buried years ago, a protective instinct that went beyond mere compassion. He began to study her patterns, noting how she struggled to find enough food in the snow-covered landscape. The winter had been unusually harsh, driving away many of the smaller animals she would typically hunt. Without adequate nutrition, her chances of surviving the pregnancy, let alone caring for her cubs, were slim. "You're not making this easy for me, are you, girl?" Hank muttered one morning, watching as Rose attempted to dig through the frozen ground for roots. The sight of her determination, despite her weakened state, stirred memories he'd long suppressed, of another life, of responsibilities abandoned, of connections severed. He shook his head, trying to clear away the thoughts, but they clung to him like frost on pine needles. Against every principle of wildlife management he'd learned over the years, Hank began to prepare for what he knew would be a challenging few months. He started storing extra meat in his cabin's cold storage, smoking fish he caught from the partially frozen stream, and gathering whatever edible vegetation he could find under the snow. Each time he brought food to Rose, he maintained a careful distance, respecting the delicate balance between assistance and interference. The brutal winter showed no signs of relenting. Storm after storm swept through the mountains, blanketing the landscape in fresh layers of snow. Hank watched with growing concern as Rose struggled to find adequate shelter. The natural caves and dens in the area were either too exposed to the elements or already occupied by other wildlife. After a particularly severe blizzard, he made a decision that would forever alter the course of both their lives. Using his knowledge of wilderness survival, Hank began constructing a makeshift shelter for Rose. He worked tirelessly, gathering fallen branches and weaving them together to create a sturdy framework. From his own cabin, he brought heavy blankets and tarps, materials he'd stored away and nearly forgotten about. The shelter took shape gradually, hidden from the main trails and positioned to protect its occupant from the bitter mountain winds. "It's not much," he said softly, stepping back to survey his work, "but it should keep you warm." Rose watched from a distance as he completed the shelter, her intelligent eyes following his every move. The trust between them had grown slowly but steadily, like a sapling taking root in rocky soil. She no longer showed signs of stress when he approached, though Hank never took this acceptance for granted. As the weeks passed, Hank found himself talking to Rose more frequently, his voice growing stronger with use. He shared stories of his past adventures in the mountains, of the changes he'd seen over the years, and sometimes, in moments of particular vulnerability, of the losses that had driven him to this solitary existence. Rose would listen, her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made him wonder if she somehow understood the weight of the words he spoke. The transformation in Hank didn't go unnoticed by the few people he encountered during his occasional trips into town for supplies. The store owner's wife commented on the lightness in his step, the new spark in his eyes. Hank deflected their observations with non-committal grunts, but privately, he couldn't deny the change in himself. The wall of isolation he'd built around his heart was developing cracks, letting in pinpricks of light he'd thought he'd never see again. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and painted the snow in shades of pink and gold, Hank sat at his usual spot near Rose's shelter, maintaining the respectful distance they'd established. The air was sharp with cold, but the sky was clear, promising another freezing night. As he watched Rose settle into her shelter, he noticed her breathing had become more labored, her movements more careful. The signs were clear. She would give birth soon. The realization filled him with equal parts excitement and dread. Birth in the wilderness was always a precarious event, and the ongoing winter had only made conditions more challenging. Hank knew the next few days would be critical, not just for Rose and her cubs, but for him as well. He had crossed a line in choosing to help her, and now there was no turning back. As he made his way back to his cabin that night, the stars emerging like diamonds in the darkening sky, Hank felt the weight of his decisions settling around his shoulders like a familiar blanket. Little did he know that the real challenges were yet to come. The birth of Rose's cubs would set in motion a series of events that would not only test his commitment to protecting them, but would also force him to confront the very reasons he'd chosen a life of solitude in the first place. As he prepared for the impending arrival, gathering additional supplies and reinforcing the shelter, Hank couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. The night the cubs were born, a fierce blizzard raged through the mountains, as if nature itself was marking the significance of the moment. Hank had been restless all evening, pacing his cabin floor, listening to the howling wind and watching the snow pile up against his windows. Something in the air, perhaps the same instinct that had served him well during his years in the wilderness, told him this was the night. Despite the treacherous conditions, he grabbed his emergency gear and ventured out into the storm. The wind cut through his heavy coat like icy daggers, and the snow, driven horizontal by the gale, stung his exposed face. The beam of his flashlight carved a narrow path through the darkness as he made his way to Rose's shelter, his feet finding the familiar route even in the near-zero visibility. As he approached the shelter, he heard sounds that confirmed his intuition, the low, labored growls of Rose in the midst of giving birth. Hank settled himself at a safe distance, close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough to avoid causing any stress. Hours passed as he maintained his vigil, the storm raging around them, while Rose brought new life into the world. By dawn, the storm had subsided, and 3 tiny cubs had joined the world. Hank watched in amazement as Rose tenderly cared for her newborns, cleaning them and keeping them warm against her body. The smallest of the 3, noticeably weaker than its siblings, particularly caught his attention. Something about its determined struggles to reach its mother's warmth stirred deep emotions in Hank. "That's it, little Tommy," he whispered, the name coming to him naturally as he watched the smallest cub. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" The other 2 cubs he named silently in his head. The larger male became Buck, and the female Sea Stars with a distinctive white patch on her chest he called Star. Each had their own personality, evident even in these early days. The following weeks became a delicate dance of care and caution. Hank increased his visits, bringing food more frequently now that Rose needed to maintain her strength to nurse the cubs. He learned to read the subtle changes in her behavior, when she welcomed his presence and when she needed space. The trust between them deepened, founded on mutual respect and understanding. Tommy, the smallest cub, continued to capture Hank's attention. While his siblings grew stronger each day, Tommy's progress was slower, more deliberate. Hank found himself particularly invested in the little cub's survival, seeing in his determination a reflection of his own struggles against adversity. He began spending more time observing the family, taking notes in a worn journal, documenting every milestone in the cub's development. As winter began to loosen its grip on the mountains, new challenges emerged. The warming weather brought more activity to the area, the first hints of the tourist season to come. Hank noticed increased traffic on the distant trails and occasionally caught the sound of vehicles on the forest service roads. Each intrusion into the peaceful isolation sent a spike of anxiety through him. One morning, while approaching the shelter with his usual offering of food, Hank froze at the sight of fresh boot prints in the melting snow, prints that weren't his own. Someone had been in the area, close enough to potentially discover Rose and her cubs. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The peaceful bubble he'd created around his newfound family was more fragile than he'd imagined. The discovery forced Hank to become more vigilant. He began setting false trails, leading away from the shelter, and took increasingly complex routes to avoid being followed. His protective instincts, once awakened, drove him to extraordinary lengths to ensure the safety of Rose and her cubs. Each day brought new worries: the sound of a distant helicopter, the bark of a dog on a hiking trail, the glimpse of a camera lens reflecting sunlight. The cubs, unaware of these concerns, continued to grow and explore their small world. Buck showed early signs of his mother's strength, often leading his siblings in playful wrestling matches. Star proved to be the most curious, always first to investigate new sounds or smells. And Tommy, though still the smallest, displayed a surprising cleverness in finding ways to keep up with his more robust siblings. Hank found himself spending more time at the shelter than at his own cabin, his previous solitary routine forgotten in the face of his new responsibilities. He began to notice subtle changes in himself, the way he smiled more often, how he spoke aloud his thoughts, sharing them with Rose as if she could understand every word. The wall of isolation he'd built around himself continued to crumble, brick by brick. One afternoon, as he watched the cubs tumbling in a patch of spring sunshine, Hank heard a familiar voice calling his name from the direction of the main trail. His heart nearly stopped. It was Mike Reynolds, the local conservation officer, and one of the few people Hank had considered a friend in his previous life. The sound served as a harsh reminder that his peaceful existence with Rose and her cubs existed on borrowed time. The outside world was closing in, and soon he would have to make decisions that would affect not only his life, but the lives of the bears he had come to care for so deeply. As Mike's voice grew closer, Hank quickly gathered his things, quietly apologized to Rose, and moved to intercept his old friend before he could discover the shelter. The peaceful isolation of winter was ending, and with it, the simple clarity of Hank's mission to protect his adopted family. The real challenges were just beginning, and they would test not only his ingenuity but also his understanding of where the line between human and wild truly lay. Meeting Mike on the trail that afternoon marked the beginning of a new phase in Hank's complicated situation. His old friend stood before him, looking much the same as he had years ago, the green uniform of the Conservation Service neat and pressed, badge glinting in the spring sunlight. But there was something different in Mike's eyes, a tension that hadn't been there before. "Hank," Mike said, extending his hand. "Been a while since anyone's seen you around town. Some folks were starting to wonder if you'd become a hermit for good." The attempt at humor fell flat, the underlying concern in Mike's voice too obvious to ignore. Hank forced a smile, acutely aware of how close they were to Rose's shelter. "You know me, Mike. I prefer the company of trees to people most days." He deliberately positioned himself to block the path that led to the bears, hoping his old friend wouldn't notice the nervousness in his stance. "That's actually why I'm here," Mike said, his expression growing serious. "We've been getting reports of bear activity in the area, more than usual for this time of year. Some of the local farmers are getting nervous, especially with calving season coming up." He paused, studying Hank's face. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Hank felt his heart rate quicken, but kept his expression neutral. "Bears are part of these mountains, Mike. Always have been. You know that better than most." He gestured to the surrounding forest. "This is their home too." Mike sighed, removing his service cap and running a hand through his graying hair. "Times are changing, Hank. The tourist board is pushing for more trails in this area. They're talking about expanding the scenic routes, maybe even putting in some viewing platforms. The farmers are already complaining about predator control, and now with these new developments..." He trailed off, leaving the implications unspoken. The news hit Hank like a physical blow. More trails meant more people, more disturbance, more risk to Rose and her cubs. He thought of Tommy, still so small and vulnerable, and felt a surge of protective anger. "This is protected wilderness, Mike. They can't just come in and build whatever they want." "They can with the right permits," Mike replied quietly. "And they're getting them. Look, Hank, I know you've got your reasons for living up here, for keeping to yourself. I've respected that. But something's different about you lately. The store owners say you're buying more supplies than usual. Some hikers reported seeing you setting what looked like false trails. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. If you're involved with something, if you're trying to protect something, I need to know. The moment stretched between them, years of friendship warring with Hank's need to protect his secret. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and measured. The mountains have their own ways, Mike. Sometimes the best thing we can do is let them be. Before Mike could respond, a distant sound caught their attention, the whop-whop-whop of helicopter blades cutting through the mountain air. Hank's heart jumped into his throat as he recognized the sound of a survey chopper, probably part of the development plans Mike had mentioned. The conversation ended shortly after, with Mike promising to return soon. As Hank watched his friend disappear down the trail, he knew the peaceful existence he'd carved out was under threat. The outside world was pressing in from all sides, and he needed to act quickly to protect Rose and her cubs. Over the next few days, Hank threw himself into preparation. He spent hours studying maps of the surrounding wilderness, looking for alternative locations where the bears might be safer. He began stockpiling supplies, knowing that any move would need to be carefully planned and executed. The cubs were still young, and any journey would be risky. But it wasn't just the physical challenges that worried him. As he watched Rose teaching her cubs to forage, Buck testing his strength against fallen logs, Star exploring every new scent with boundless curiosity, and Tommy cleverly finding ways to keep up with his siblings, Hank realized how deeply entwined his life had become with theirs. The thought of losing them, of failing to protect them, was almost unbearable. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Hank sat near the shelter, making notes in his journal. The cubs were playing nearby, their playful growls and tumbling bringing a smile to his face despite his worries. Rose watched her offspring with protective pride, occasionally glancing at Hank with what he'd come to recognize as trust in her eyes. The peaceful scene was interrupted by the distant sound of voices, hikers who had strayed from the main trail. Hank quickly gathered his things, ready to create a distraction if necessary, when he noticed Tommy had wandered further from the shelter than usual, curious about the new sounds. The little cub stood at the edge of a small ridge, unaware of the potential danger, while the voices grew closer. In that moment, watching Tommy's vulnerable form silhouetted against the sunset, Hank made a decision. He couldn't wait any longer. The time had come to move Rose and her cubs to somewhere safer, somewhere deeper in the wilderness. But as he began to formulate his plan, he had no way of knowing that his decision would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about survival, friendship, and the true meaning of family. The morning Hank chose to begin scouting for a new location dawned clear and crisp, with the kind of pristine mountain air that made every distant peak seem within arm's reach. He had spent the night poring over topographical maps, marking potential routes and safe havens, his mind racing with possibilities and dangers. The gentle light of his oil lamp had cast long shadows across the cabin walls as he worked, matching the growing shadows in his thoughts. Rising before dawn, he packed his survey gear and headed out, leaving extra food for Rose and her cubs. The first signs of spring were everywhere, tender shoots pushing through melting snow, the calls of returning birds, and the gradual greening of the mountain slopes. Under different circumstances, Hank would have welcomed these changes. Now, each sign of the advancing season felt like a countdown timer. His exploration took him deeper into the wilderness than he'd ventured in years. He moved carefully, marking his trail and taking detailed notes about water sources, natural shelters, and potential food availability. The terrain grew increasingly challenging as he pushed further into the backcountry, away from any established trails or human presence. As he crested a particularly steep ridge, Hank discovered a hidden valley that seemed promising. A clear stream wound through it, and several natural caves dotted the surrounding cliffs. The area was rich with berry bushes that would fruit in the coming months, and signs of small game were abundant. Most importantly, it was far from any planned development or tourist routes, but getting Rose and 3 young cubs there would be the real challenge. The journey would take them across exposed terrain, through areas frequented by other predators, and over obstacles that would test even an adult bear's capabilities. Hank thought of Tommy, the smallest cub, and his heart clenched with worry. Returning to the shelter that afternoon, Hank found Rose unusually agitated. Her behavior immediately put him on alert, and it didn't take long to discover the cause: fresh boot prints in the mud near the shelter, along with something that made his blood run cold: the metallic glint of a wildlife camera strapped to a nearby tree. With trembling hands, Hank retrieved the camera. It was a high-end model, the kind used by professional wildlife photographers or research teams. Someone had been monitoring the area, and from the position of the camera, they knew about Rose and her cubs. The implications hit him like an avalanche. Their secret wasn't safe anymore. That evening, as he sat in his cabin reviewing the day's notes, an unexpected knock at his door nearly made him jump out of his skin. It was Mike, and this time he wasn't alone. A woman in a crisp business suit stood beside him, her tablet computer clutched professionally against her chest. "Hank," Mike said, his expression grave, "this is Ms. Sarah Chen from the Wildlife Conservation Board. She needs to speak with you about some observations in the area." The woman stepped forward, offering a practiced smile. "Mr. Bennett, we've been monitoring unusual bear activity in this region. Our data suggests the presence of a mother and cubs, and several sources have indicated you might have information about their whereabouts." Hank's mind raced as he invited them in, careful to keep his expression neutral. The cabin suddenly felt too small, too confining, as if the walls were closing in around him. As Ms. Chen began laying out satellite images and data charts on his rough-hewn table, he realized the situation was far more complex than he'd imagined. "The board is particularly interested in this family group," she explained, pointing to thermal imaging photos that clearly showed Rose and her cubs near the shelter. "They represent a unique opportunity for our conservation studies. We're preparing to launch a comprehensive research project, and these bears would be perfect subjects." The words "research project" sent a chill down Hank's spine. He knew what that meant: tracking collars, regular monitoring, constant human interference. Everything he'd been trying to protect Rose and her cubs from. What exactly would this research involve? He asked, fighting to keep his voice steady. Miss Chen's enthusiasm was evident as she outlined the project: a team of researchers, regular observations, data collection, and most alarming of all, plans to tag and collar the bears for tracking. She spoke about it as if it were a gift, an opportunity for conservation. But all Hank could see was the end of the peaceful existence he'd helped create for Rose and her family. As the meeting continued, Hank noticed Mike watching him closely, reading the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched under the table. His old friend knew him well enough to sense his distress, but the question was, whose side would Mike choose when the time came? The conversation lasted well into the evening, and with each passing minute, Hank's resolve strengthened. He knew now that moving the bears wasn't just an option, it was an absolute necessity. But as he bid farewell to his unexpected visitors, watching their vehicle disappear down the mountain road, a new worry gnawed at him. The Wildlife Conservation Board had resources, authority, and technology on their side. Moving Rose and her cubs would mean not only battling the natural challenges of the wilderness, but also staying one step ahead of those who would track them in the name of science. That night, as a half-moon cast silver shadows through his cabin window, Hank began preparing for what he knew would be the most challenging journey of his life. The time for careful planning was over. They needed to move, and soon. But first, he had to figure out how to disable that wildlife camera without raising suspicions, and more importantly, how to keep others from following when they finally made their escape into the deeper wilderness. Dawn was just breaking when Hank began implementing his plan. The first order of business was dealing with the wildlife camera. After a sleepless night of deliberation, he'd come up with a solution that he hoped would buy them time without arousing immediate suspicion. Using his knowledge of the local wildlife, he carefully repositioned the camera to focus on an area frequented by deer and elk, making the adjustment appear as if it had been caused by natural movements of the tree it was mounted on. The next challenge was far more daunting: preparing Rose and her cubs for the journey ahead. The bears had grown accustomed to the security of their shelter and the surrounding area. The cubs, especially, had no experience with long-distance travel. Hank knew he would need to strengthen them gradually, building their stamina while remaining cautious of any observers. He began by expanding their feeding area, strategically placing food at increasing distances from the shelter, encouraging the family to venture further each day. Rose seemed to sense the purpose behind these changes, adapting quickly to the new routine. Buck and Star eagerly followed their mother's lead, but Tommy's progress concerned Hank. The smallest cub still struggled with longer distances, often lagging behind his siblings. "Come on, little one," Hank murmured encouragingly, watching Tommy determinedly navigate a steep slope. "You've got more fight in you than any of them know." His heart swelled with pride as the cub finally reached the top, using a clever zigzag pattern that made the climb easier. The sound of an approaching helicopter shattered the peaceful scene. Hank quickly directed Rose and the cubs to a concealed area they'd practiced using, his heart pounding as the aircraft passed overhead. These surveillance flights had become more frequent, and each one increased the urgency of their situation. Later that afternoon, while checking his backup trails, Hank encountered fresh boot prints that made his blood run cold. These weren't the careful tracks of conservation officers or researchers, they were the heavy imprints of hunting boots, accompanied by dog paw prints. Despite the season being closed, some locals had begun doing their own surveillance, concerned about having bears so close to their properties. Returning to his cabin that evening, Hank found a message from Mike on his satellite phone, the only concession to modern technology he maintained for emergencies. The Wildlife Conservation Board was accelerating their plans. They would be arriving within the week to begin their research project, complete with a full team and equipment. The news forced Hank to adjust his timeline. They couldn't wait any longer for the cubs to build more strength. They needed to move now. That night, he packed his emergency gear and prepared several packages of food that could be easily transported. His years of experience as a wilderness guide would be put to the ultimate test. The next morning brought an unexpected complication. A group of hikers had veered off the main trail, their voices carrying through the crisp mountain air as they approached the area near Rose's shelter. Hank watched in tense silence as Rose quickly gathered her cubs, leading them to their practiced hiding spot. But Tommy, distracted by a butterfly, didn't immediately follow. Hank's heart nearly stopped as one of the hikers raised a camera, pointing it in Tommy's direction. Without thinking, he stepped out of his concealment, deliberately making noise to draw attention to himself. "This area's closed for wildlife protection," he called out, using his most authoritative voice. "You'll need to return to the marked trail." The hikers, startled by his sudden appearance, quickly apologized and turned back. Hank waited until they were well away before checking on the bears. Tommy had finally joined his family in their hiding spot, but the close call left Hank shaken. They had nearly lost everything because of a butterfly. That evening, as he made his final preparations, Hank noticed something that added yet another layer of complexity to their situation. Rose's behavior had changed subtly. She was more protective, more alert. Years of observing wildlife told him what this meant. There was another bear in the area, likely a male attracted by Rose's presence. While a male bear might normally be a natural protector for a family group, in their current situation, it added an unpredictable element to an already complex equation. If the male was aggressive or territorial, it could force Rose to flee in an unplanned direction, potentially right into the areas they were trying to avoid. Studying his maps one last time by lamplight, Hank traced the route he had chosen for their escape. It would take them through some of the most challenging terrain in the region, but it was also the path least likely to be monitored or followed. They would need to cross 2 streams, navigate a series of steep ridges, and traverse a high mountain pass before reaching the relative safety of the hidden valley he had found. As he rolled up the maps and began gathering his gear, Hank heard the distant sound of vehicles on the Forest Service road, more than usual for this time of day. Time was running out. Tomorrow, before first light, they would need to begin their journey. Everything would depend on the next few hours, and as Hank stepped out into the gathering dusk to make his final checks, he could only hope that his preparation would be enough to see them all safely through what lay ahead. The world was still draped in pre-dawn darkness when Hank began the most crucial phase of his plan. Moving silently through the forest, his breath visible in the cold morning air, he methodically set up a series of false trails leading away from the route they would actually take. Years of wilderness experience had taught him how to lay convincing tracks while hiding his true destination, skills he'd never imagined using quite like this. His first priority was creating a diversion that would buy them precious time. Using carefully preserved bear fur he'd collected from Rose's shelter, along with strategic placement of old tracks, he created evidence of the bear family moving northeast toward a popular wildlife corridor. It would be the obvious choice for a mother bear seeking new territory, obvious enough to draw attention away from their actual route. The sky was just beginning to lighten when Hank reached Rose's shelter for what he knew would be the last time. The bear family was already awake, Rose's instincts clearly telling her that something was different about this morning. The cubs, picking up on their mother's alertness, were unusually quiet, even little Tommy, who typically greeted Hank with excited movements. "This is it, girl," Hank whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Time to trust me one more time." He began laying out small portions of high-energy food, dried meat and fish, creating a trail that would lead them toward their escape route. Rose watched him intently, her intelligent eyes following his every move, as if she understood the importance of what was about to happen. The first real challenge came as they began their journey. They needed to cross an exposed ridge while staying hidden from the valley below, where the Forest Service road wound its way through the mountains. The timing had to be perfect, early enough to avoid the daily helicopter surveys, but late enough for shadows to provide some cover. Rose led her cubs with remarkable patience, following Hank's carefully plotted course. Buck and Star stayed close to their mother, but Tommy struggled with the steep terrain. Hank's heart clenched every time the smallest cub slipped or fell behind. But the little bear showed surprising resilience, finding creative ways to navigate the difficult path. Their progress was agonizingly slow. What would have taken Hank a few hours on his own became a careful day-long journey with the bears. Every sound, a distant engine, a braking branch, the call of a bird, caused them to freeze and take cover. The cubs, unused to such sustained travel, needed frequent rest stops, which Hank used to scout ahead and check for any signs of pursuit. By mid-morning, the sun had risen fully, and the heat began to take its toll. The cubs, especially Tommy, showed signs of fatigue. They had reached a particularly challenging section, a steep old rocky slope with minimal cover. As they began their ascent, the distant sound of rotor blades echoed through the valley. Hank quickly directed the bear family into a natural hollow beneath an outcropping, his heart pounding as the helicopter drew closer. From their hiding place, he could see the aircraft following the false trail he'd laid, its occupants no doubt scanning the ground below with high-powered cameras and thermal imaging equipment. The helicopter passed overhead without spotting them, but the close call left Hank shaken. They needed to move faster, but the cubs were already pushing their limits. Looking at their small forms huddled against their mother, he realized he'd have to modify his plan. The original route he'd mapped out was too exposed. They needed an alternative path, even if it meant a longer journey. As the day progressed, new complications arose. The sound of dogs barking in the distance suggested that ground teams had begun searching the area. Worse still, Hank noticed fresh bear tracks that didn't belong to Rose or her cubs. The male bear was following them. Its presence added an unpredictable element to their already precarious situation. By late afternoon, they reached a critical point in their journey, a narrow pass between two peaks that they needed to traverse before nightfall. The pass offered their best chance of losing any pursuers, but it was treacherous terrain, especially for young cubs. As they approached, storm clouds began gathering above the mountains, threatening to add yet another layer of difficulty to their escape. Hank studied the darkening sky with growing concern. A storm would make the pass even more dangerous, but turning back wasn't an option. They were committed now, for better or worse. As thunder rumbled in the distance, he looked at Rose and her cubs, particularly at Tommy, who despite his exhaustion maintained a determined gleam in his eyes. "We'll make it through this," Hank promised softly, though he wasn't sure if he was reassuring the bears or himself. The wind was picking up, carrying with it the first few drops of rain. Behind them, The sounds of searching dogs grew slightly louder, while ahead, the narrow pass waited, their gateway to either safety or disaster. As they began their approach to the pass, Hank couldn't shake the feeling that the next few hours would test them all in ways they couldn't imagine. The storm was building, daylight was fading, and somewhere behind them, multiple search teams were closing in. Their journey had only begun, and already it was proving more challenging than even his worst predictions. The storm hit with full force just as they reached the entrance to the narrow pass. Wind howled through the rocky corridor, bringing with it stinging rain and occasional bursts of hail. Visibility dropped dramatically, forcing Hank to rely more on his intimate knowledge of the terrain than his sight. The bears moved cautiously behind him, Rose keeping her cubs close as they navigated the treacherous path. Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating the sheer rock walls on either side of them. In those brief moments of brilliant light, Hank could see the challenge that lay ahead. The pass narrowed significantly about halfway through, with a particularly precarious section where the path hugged the cliff face. Under normal conditions, it would be dangerous. In this storm, it was nearly impossible. "Easy now," Hank called out over the wind, more for his own comfort than the bears. Rose followed his lead with remarkable trust, her powerful form protecting her cubs from the worst of the weather. Buck and Star stayed close to their mother, but Tommy struggled against the powerful gusts that threatened to knock his small frame off balance. They were halfway through the pass when disaster struck. A powerful lightning bolt hit somewhere above them, sending a shower of rocks and debris down the cliff face. Hank turned just in time to see Tommy lose his footing, sliding toward the edge of the path. Without thinking, he lunged forward, using his walking stick to create a barrier that stopped the cub's slide. Rose let out a worried growl, but couldn't reach Tommy without risking her other cubs in the narrow space. For a terrifying moment, everything hung in balance, Tommy scrambling to regain his footing, Rose torn between her cubs, and Hank stretched out precariously on the rain-slicked rock. Finally, Tommy managed to pull himself back to safety, immediately pressing close to his mother. Hank's heart was pounding, but they couldn't stop. The storm was getting worse, and the sounds of searching dogs, though muffled by the wind, were still audible in the distance. As they emerged from the other side of the pass, Hank's relief was short-lived. The path ahead led down into a valley he'd planned to cross before making their final ascent to safety. But the storm had transformed the usually manageable terrain into a treacherous slope of mud and loose rocks. Worse still, the stream that ran through the valley had swollen with rain, turning into a raging torrent. They needed shelter, somewhere to wait out the worst of the storm. Hank knew of a cave system nearby, one he'd mapped years ago but rarely visited due to its remote location. Getting there meant deviating from their planned route, but the alternative was risking injury or worse on the rain-soaked slopes. The decision was made for them when another lightning strike illuminated a massive form on the ridge above. The male bear had found them. Its silhouette against the stormy sky was both magnificent and terrifying. Rose immediately positioned herself between the male and her cubs, but in these conditions, a confrontation could be fatal for everyone involved. "This way," Hank urged, leading them toward the cave system. The male bear's presence actually worked in their favor, as its tracks would help confuse any pursuers. They moved as quickly as they dared through the driving rain, the cubs struggling to keep up in the increasingly muddy conditions. The cave entrance was partially hidden behind a curtain of water running off the rocks above. Hank went in first, checking for other occupants with his flashlight. Finding it empty, he guided Rose and her cubs inside. The cave was deeper than he remembered, with several chambers leading away from the entrance. The sound of the storm was muffled here, creating an almost peaceful atmosphere compared to the chaos outside. As the bears settled into one of the larger chambers, Hank worked quickly to erase any obvious signs of their entrance. The rain would help mask their tracks, but he couldn't risk being careless. The male bear's tracks crisscrossed the area, which would help confuse any tracking dogs. But Hank knew their pursuers would have more than just dogs at their disposal. In the relative safety of the cave, Hank finally had a chance to check on his charges. The cubs were exhausted but unharmed. Even Tommy, despite his near fall, seemed resilient. Rose was alert but calm, apparently trusting their temporary sanctuary. As Hank shared out some of their dwindling food supplies, he used the time to plan their next move. The storm might buy them some time, but it also meant that when they did move on, the terrain would be even more challenging. The swollen stream would need to be crossed, and the muddy slopes would make climbing treacherous. They needed rest. But they couldn't afford to stay in one place too long. As night fell outside the cave, Hank kept watch near the entrance, listening to the storm's fury. The occasional flash of lightning illuminated the valley below, and in one of these flashes, he caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run cold. Distant lights moving through the trees, too steady to be natural, too purposeful to be anything but searchers. The storm had bought them some time, but tomorrow would bring new challenges. They would need to navigate not only the treacherous terrain, but also evade what appeared to be an increasingly organized search effort. As Hank watched the lights in the distance, he began formulating a plan, one that would require perfect timing and more than a little luck to succeed. Dawn broke with an eerie calm after the storm, the air heavy with mist and the scent of wet earth. Hank stood at the cave entrance, studying the transformed landscape before him. The valley below had become a maze of swollen streams and muddy slopes, while the surrounding peaks were shrouded in lingering clouds. Every detail of their escape route would need to be reconsidered. But they couldn't wait any longer. During his night watch, Hank had spotted more searchlights, moving in organized patterns that suggested a coordinated effort. The Wildlife Conservation Board had apparently called in additional resources, and from the occasional radio chatter carried on the wind, he knew they were closing in on their location. "Time to move, girl," he whispered to Rose, who was already alert and watching him. The cubs stirred, their small bodies still tired from yesterday's ordeal. Tommy, especially, seemed reluctant to leave the cave's safety. But his eyes held that familiar determination that had come to mean so much to Hank. Their first challenge lay immediately before them, crossing the valley that had become a network of rushing water and unstable ground. The main stream had split into several channels, creating a series of treacherous crossings. Hank led them carefully, testing each step before allowing the bears to follow. The male bear's tracks were still visible in places, leading away from their position. Hank used this to their advantage, deliberately crossing paths with these tracks when possible, creating a confusing trail that would be difficult for even experienced trackers to decipher. They had made it halfway across the valley when the sound of an approaching helicopter shattered the morning quiet. Without warning, Rose herded her cubs into a dense thicket of undergrowth while Hank pressed himself against a rocky outcrop. The aircraft passed overhead at low altitude, its occupants clearly scanning the ground with sophisticated equipment. As soon as it passed, they pushed on, but the encounter had left them all on edge. The cubs stayed unusually close to their mother, even Buck, who typically liked to forge his own path. Tommy, however, seemed to have found new strength in the crisis, keeping pace with his siblings with a determination that made Hank's chest swell with pride. Their progress was painstakingly slow, each step carefully chosen to avoid leaving obvious tracks. Hank used every trick he'd learned in his years as a wilderness guide, crossing on rocks, using fallen logs, taking advantage of natural features that wouldn't hold prints, but the muddy ground made complete concealment impossible. By mid-morning, they reached the base of the final ridge that separated them from their destination. The hidden valley lay just on the other side, promising sanctuary with its remote location and abundant resources. But getting there meant climbing an almost vertical slope, made slick and unstable by the recent storm. As they began their ascent, Hank heard something that made his heart race, dogs barking much closer than before. The search teams had found their trail despite his precautions. Looking back, he could see movement in the valley below, multiple teams converging on their location. "We have to hurry," he urged, though he knew speed would make their climb more dangerous. Rose seemed to understand the urgency, encouraging her cubs forward with gentle nudges. The ascent became a blur of desperate scrambling, with Hank helping the cubs over particularly difficult sections while constantly checking their precarious progress. They were 3/4 of the way up when Tommy slipped. The smallest cub lost his footing on the wet rocks, sliding several feet before managing to catch himself on a small ledge. The sight nearly stopped Hank's heart. Rose let out a distressed growl, but she couldn't reach her cub without risking her other 2 children. Without hesitation, Hank carefully made his way to Tommy's position. The ledge was barely wide enough for the small cub, and one wrong move could send them both tumbling down the slope. The voices below were getting closer. They were running out of time. "Trust me, little one," Hank whispered, slowly extending his hand toward the trembling cub. Tommy looked at him with those intelligent eyes that had first captured Hank's heart months ago. For a moment, everything else faded away. The pursuit, the danger, the impossible situation they were in. It was just man and bear, bound by something deeper than nature intended. Tommy made a small sound, almost like a whimper, and pressed himself against Hank's arm. With infinite care, Hank helped the cub find secure footing, guiding him back to the main path where Rose waited with the others. The relief in the mother bear's eyes was unmistakable, and Hank felt a profound connection in that moment that transcended species. But their moment of triumph was short-lived. The sounds of pursuit were getting dangerously close, and they still had the final section of the ridge to navigate. The summit was tantalizingly close, just 100 feet above them, with safety waiting on the other side. Yet these last 100 feet would be the most exposed, the most dangerous part of their entire journey. As they prepared for the final push, Hank made a decision that would change everything. He knew what he had to do, even though it meant putting his own future at risk. Looking at Rose and her cubs, at Tommy's trusting eyes, at Star's curious gaze, at Buck's determined stance, he knew it was worth it. The hidden valley awaited them, but first, Hank would have to make one last desperate gambit to ensure their freedom. Standing at the precipice of his decision, Hank took one last look at the family he had grown to love. Rose's eyes met his, filled with a trust that had been earned through months of care and protection. The cubs, exhausted but determined, huddled close to their mother. In that moment, Hank knew exactly what he had to do. With swift, practiced movements, he removed his outer jacket and began laying a false trail that led away from the bears of position. The jacket would carry his scent strongly enough to attract the tracking dogs. Then, taking his emergency flare, he moved to a spot about 50 yards away from the bears and set it off, the bright red light cutting through the morning mist. "Go," he whispered to Rose, gesturing toward the summit. "I'll lead them away." The mother bear hesitated for just a moment, as if understanding the sacrifice he was making. Then, with the instinct for survival that had guided her species for millennia, she began leading her cubs up the final stretch toward freedom. The search teams responded to the flare exactly as Hank had hoped. Their shouts and the barking of their dogs converged on his position, away from the bears' calm escape route. Through gaps in the mist, he could see figures in uniform making their way up the slope, following his deliberately obvious trail. Mike's voice carried above the others. "Hank, we know you're trying to protect them, but this has gone too far." The concern in his old friend's voice was genuine, but Hank couldn't reply. Any sound from him might give away the bear's position. Instead, he continued moving laterally across the slope, laying down more false trails. Through careful glances over his shoulder, Hank watched Rose and her cubs make steady progress toward the summit. Tommy, showing strength that would have seemed impossible months ago, kept pace with his siblings. The sight filled Hank's heart with pride and bittersweet joy. They were going to make it. The pursuit team was closing in on his position when a powerful roar echoed across the mountainside. The male bear had returned, appearing on a ridge above the search party. The unexpected appearance caused momentary chaos among the teams, buying precious extra seconds for Rose and her cubs. Finally, through the swirling mist, Hank saw what he'd been praying for, Rose and her cubs cresting the summit. They paused there for just a moment, silhouetted against the brightening sky before disappearing over the other side toward the hidden valley. A valley that would give them everything they needed: food, shelter, and most importantly, freedom from human interference. With the bears safely away, Hank stopped running. He stood straight and tall as the search team surrounded him, Mike at their lead. Mrs. Chen from the Wildlife Conservation Board was there too, her pristine business suit now muddy and disheveled. "The bears?" Mike asked simply. Hank gestured vaguely in the wrong direction. "Gone into the wilderness, where they belong." His voice was firm, carrying the conviction of someone who knew he had done the right thing. To his surprise, Mrs. Chen stepped forward with an unexpected smile. Mr. Bennett, your dedication to these bears has been enlightening. Perhaps we've been approaching this all wrong. Instead of capturing and studying them, maybe we should be learning from people like you, people who understand the true meaning of conservation. The next few hours passed in a blur of explanations and negotiations. Hank's reputation as a wilderness expert, combined with his obvious commitment to wildlife protection, led to an unexpected outcome. Instead of sanctions, he was offered a position as a conservation advisor, helping to establish guidelines for wildlife observation that would respect the animals' natural behaviors and needs. The hidden valley where Rose and her cubs had found sanctuary was designated as a protected area, closed to development and regular human access. Only limited, carefully monitored research would be allowed, and even then from a safe distance that wouldn't disturb the bears. Months later, Hank stood at his cabin window, watching a summer sunset paint the mountains in brilliant colors. His life had changed in ways he never expected. While he still valued his solitude, he had found a new purpose in sharing his knowledge and passion for wildlife protection with others. Occasionally, when his duties took him near the hidden valley, he would catch glimpses of a familiar family, a mother bear and 3 growing cubs, one slightly smaller than the others, but moving with confidence through their mountain home. He never approached them, never tried to recreate the connection they had shared during those intense months. Some bonds, he had learned, were meant to be temporary, but remain eternal in their impact. Tommy and his family had taught Hank something profound about the true meaning of protection. Sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go. The mountains had given him a second chance at purpose, and in return, he had helped ensure that a small piece of true wilderness would remain, where bears could live free from human interference, raising their cubs as nature intended. As the last rays of sunlight faded from the peaks, Hank smiled, knowing that somewhere in those mountains, a family of bears was thriving wild and free. His heart was at peace, filled with the quiet satisfaction of having made a difference in the world, one bear family at a time. And so, the mountains kept their secrets, and the bears kept their freedom, while one man's love for the wilderness continued to inspire others to protect the delicate balance between human progress and natural preservation. In the end, it wasn't just a story about saving bears, it was about finding hope, purpose, and the courage to stand up for what's right, even when the path ahead seems impossible. In the gathering dusk, as the stars began to appear above the mountain peaks, the legacy of Hank's choice lived on in every free creature that called these mountains home, a testament to the enduring power of compassion, courage, and the unbreakable bonds between all living things. Dear listeners, we hope that Hank Bennett's story and his extraordinary journey with Rose and her cubs has touched your hearts. To continue this emotional journey through the world of nature and conservation, we have prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories. Find it here by clicking on your left. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your like on the video. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of life and the beauty of the natural world. Don't miss our upcoming content. Share your own stories of connection with nature in the comments.